To our Daf Yomi this morning, as we're doing. So today, I'll get right into it. I'll give a little update. You're in the right place. Shana Tova again. So the today's Daf in Masechet Bava Batra is 103, Kuf Gimel. And yesterday we started a new parak, and the new parak I'm going to read. I'll read outside. I don't think we need to read the whole Mishnah, but basically the Mishnah said that if a person goes to somebody else and says, "I want to sell you a beit kor." Now, a beit kor, we discussed last night, is 15 times the area of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was 100 by 50 amot, so 5,000 square amot. And this is 15 times that, or 75,000 square amot, which according to someone, I can't tell you I know these sources well, is around 7.5 acres. Okay, so a very sizable plot of land. And I guess that's what a farmer would use to grow. So if you sell someone a beit kor, the Mishnah said, let's say you say, I'm selling you a beit kor of afar, of dirt, right? Then if there are ditches in it that are more than 10 tvachim deep, remember for Shabbat, we always talked about 10 tvachim as being its own space, right? Its own area, own reshut, basically. So that's considered to be basically a separate field. Now, we're going to see today, and we started talking about this yesterday, that doesn't mean you can't plant in that separate space. It just means that it's hard to do it at the same time as the regular field. And if you have rocks, which seem to be a whole different category because they're really unplantable, right? If you have a big stone and it's more than 10 tvachim tall, then it doesn't count with the field. Let's say you have the 7 acres and, 5% of it is rocks. That doesn't count. You have to replace that space, okay? Now, Pachot mikan, the Mishnah said, if it was smaller than that amount, meaning the ditches were less than 10 tvachim, or the rocks were less than 10 tvachim, then it seems like it would count with the field. I think we're going to talk about this today. But if you say specifically not a beit kor, but like a beit kor, kib beit kor, then you're more lenient. Then you accept more imperfections in the ground, and then even these things would be acceptable. Now, we then contrasted that last night to a Mishnah in Masechet Erechim, and maybe we'll read that Mishnah again. So turn back to Daf Kuf Bet Amud Bet, and the third line from the bottom is the Gemara. It's not Natam. We learned in a Mishnah there, in Masechet Erechim, Hamakdish Sadeo B'Shat HaYovel, a person who gives their field to Hektish during the time that Yovel is applying, meaning that there still is Yovel, and therefore these special halachot of redemption apply. Now, the Torah's halacha of redemption was basically that if you give a field to Hektish and you want to then redeem it from Hektish, if it's a field that's plantable, then for each chomer seorim, which is the same as a beit kor in our Mishnah, each, let's say the same amount, 15 times the Mishkan, each place that you can plant a chomer of seorim, you have to redeem it for 50 shekel for the Yovel cycle, which we said is divided by 49 years. So 1 shekel and 1 punyan for every year. Okay, now let's say, says the Mishnah, Hamakdish Sadeo B'Shat HaYovel, you give your Sadeh to Hektish at the time of Yovel, and now you want to redeem it. Notein lo, you have to pay Hektish the Beit Zera for the place you can plant a Chomer Sorim, a Chomer, which is the acres of barley, 50 shekel kesef, 50 shekel. Says the Mishnah, Hayusham Nikaim Amukim Asarat Tvachim, very similar to our Mishnah. If you have crevices or ditches that are 10 Tvachim deep, or you have rocks that are 10 tvachim tall, then then those are not counted. So then you don't have to redeem those for the same ratio of 50 shekel for 49 years. Now, continues the Mishnah, if it's smaller than that, and ask the Gemara today about the Mishnah in Erechim, Amai, why would you say that if you have a ditch, not a rock, but if you have a ditch, that's more than 10 tvachim deep. Let's say you have a field that's 7 acres, and 1 acre is a totally lower amount, right? It's not usable with the rest of the field. But still, why don't you say it's hektish on its own? And you have to redeem it in the same ratio of 50 shekel for a kor, prorated. It wouldn't make any difference. So ask the Gemara, Likdushu ba'ampe nafshayo. The chitema, you might say, well, that the reason you can't say it's hektish is because it's less than a beit kor. It's less than a chomer. And therefore, it's a small field. And a small field cannot become hektish in this way. The chitema, you might say, that's third line, Kivan de lo havi beit kor. It's because it's a smaller field, right? It's a portion of the big field that's a beit kor, lo kadshi. So therefore, it does not become hektish, or at least not hektish in this way. But Tanya, but there's a Braita that says that's not correct. So the Braita says the word in the pasuk and the Vayikra says an extra word sadeh. Mata malomer. Why do you say the extra word sadeh, field? Lefisha nemer, because it's said already. 3 psukim before. Zera chomer saorim b'chamishim shekel kesef. You have to, the planting of a proportion of field that's chomer saorim, you pay 50 shekel kesef. Ainli ela shikdish binyan hazeh. I would only know if you do a big field that's big enough to plant a chomer of saorim. Minayin the rabot, a smaller area like a letech, which is smaller than that, or a chatzi letech, half a letech, or a sa'ah, which is smaller, or a tarkav, which is, as we talked about, as half a sa'ah, or chatzi tarkav, which is a quarter of a sa'ah. How do you know that all of these things can become hektish and you just redeem them in a prorated way? So if it would be 50 shekel for a beit kor, it would be whatever divided by 15 for a sa'ah. Divided by 30 for a sa'ah. Talmulomer sadeh mikol makom. So we're back to our question, and that's where we actually stopped yesterday, or we started to stop yesterday. That is the question. Why in the world, if you're makdish a field to hektish, that includes sections in the field that are very deep and therefore are not really part of the field, but so what? Why don't they go to hektish as a separate field? So says Rav Ukva Bar Chama, and this is the crux of why we're quoting this, Hacha binikaim mileim mayim askina. These are not another field. These are ditches that are full of water, right? They basically are swamps, and therefore you can't plant in them. Delav b'nei zriyanin. You can't plant in these areas, and that's why they don't go to hektish in that format. Because the whole halacha of redeeming something from hektish with 50 shekel for a certain amount of years is based on plantable land. These are not plantable because they're not just deeper, they are filled with water, and therefore they are unusable for putting your grain into. And says where that makes a lot of sense. Dekanami, that's what the Mishnah means. The Katani, it says dumya dislaim, right? The contrasting cases were ditches and rocks. Now rocks, of course, you can't plant in a rock no matter how tall or short it is, right? You can't plant grain on top of a rock. So Shema Mina, that the case of the ditches is also a case where you can't plant anything, okay? So says the Gemara, well, if that's the case, I don't understand. What if it's less than 10, right, and it's full of water, right? Or what if it's less than 10 and it's a rock, right? You still can't plant in it. So even if it's 5 tfachim deep, it seems like it's a problem. This is not necessarily, because every land has imperfections, right? There's no field that you can plant that's 100% smooth or 100% clear. That's considered to be part of the land. When it's a very small amount, it's either a very narrow, very shallow, or very small rock, those are called, as the Gemara says, Hanu are called Nigai Da'ara Mikri. They're called, the cracks in the land, meaning, sure, it's not usable, but it's a tiny fraction. Or Shidre Da'ara, they're called the spine of the land, which is the rocks, right? Mikri, meaning that they're part of the land when it's a very diminutive amount. It's only when it becomes something chashuv. And therefore, that's what the Mishnah means in Erechim, that if you dedicate a field to the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishnah says you don't count the part of the field that's very deep or that's high because of rocks, but we had to explain that only means you don't count it if you can't plant on it because it's full of water. Because otherwise, even if it was a separate field, it would still go to hektish. The question here, asked the Gemara, and the reason we're bringing all of this, is hacha mai. How does this translate into the halacha of Bava Batra? Because in Bava Batra, the idea here is that you bought a field, right? You went to someone and said, I want to purchase your field, okay? Now, if there's a ditch in that field, the question is, do you want to purchase the ditch? Because even though it's difficult to farm, because you're going to have to get down off your tractor maybe, or if your plow, move the animals down into the ditch, but it's still usable, right? Or is our Mishnah only talking, and therefore you would buy it, and therefore our Mishnah would only be excluding it if it was full of water, in which case it wasn't usable? Or would our Mishnah be even going beyond that? So says Rav Papa, our Mishnah is going beyond that. Amar Rav Papa, afal pi she'ena mele'im mayim. When our Mishnah says that a ditch is excluded, that's even if it's not full of water and it's completely farmable. My taima, why is that excluded if it's completely farmable? Because ein adam rotzeh shitein motav makom echad A person does not want to invest their money in one place, in one plot of land, but it appears like it's two or three pieces of land. And because, as the Rashbam and all explain, it requires much more work to get into that other land, right? You have to have one row that's normal, and then you have to go down into it, you have to harvest out of it. And therefore, unlike Hektish, where we would assume that if the ditch was farmable, it would belong to Hektish. By a purchase, a person says, I want a field. The assumption is they want one contiguous field. And if this ditch, this deep area is not contiguous, quote unquote, because it's more than 10 tefachim deep, it's not considered to be part of the field. Says the Gemara, that's makes a lot of sense, but the language doesn't make sense. Matkifla Ravina asked Ravina, we are around 10 lines from the bottom, in the middle of the line, remember, your whole proof in Erechim was that you compared the ditch to the rocks, just like the Slaim. We're reading inside the Gemara now. Lav b'nei aninu. They're not something you can use to plant. Afhani nami lav b'nei aninu. Here too, the ditches are not suitable for planting. And so the Gemara our Mishnah seems to make a parallel between a ditch and a rock. Now, a rock, by definition, almost, is something you can't plant on. So maybe the ditch should also be something that's full of water that's not plantable. Says Gemara, not necessarily, because the reason we compared the slaim to the ditch, to the rock, is ki katani, when we said that, was dumya dislaim apachot mikan. It was referring to the other case where it's less than 10 tefachim high or less than 10 tefachim deep. There, our point was that even though a rock that's, say, 3 inches tall, you can't plant on that rock, but because it's such a small thing, you plant around it, and that's considered to be a normal, say, a blemish of a field. The same thing would be true about a ditch. If a ditch was only 3 tefachim deep, even if it was full of water and it was unusable, it would still be considered part of the land, because that's considered to be absorbed into the normal land. And so therefore, our Mishnah is only saying that you compare a ditch to the rock for pachot mikan, but not for above that. And above 10 tefachim, you would exclude a ditch even if it was plantable, meaning even if it had good land at the bottom, just because it's a different level and therefore a different field, essentially, for you to work. Okay, now we're up to the 2 dots. I'm going to take a deep breath. 6 lines from the bottom. So the Mishnah then said something very interesting, right? It said if you sell a field to somebody and you have ditches in the field, you have rocks in the field, but they are less than 10 tefachim, then that counts as part of the field. Now, ask the Gemara, there must be a limit to how much that is, right? Because if I sell you a field, let's say, of 7 acres, and 4 acres of it are these tiny rocks, right? Obviously, it's very, very hard to plant anything in that field. So, sure, if there's 1 rock, I get it. But what's the limit? So it says the Mishnah, Pachot Mikan Dadin Ima, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, says Rabbi Yitzchak in the Gemara, Trashim Shamru. When we talk about trashim is a word for rocks, right? When we say you're allowed to have small rocks, meaning small is not so small, a foot or 2, but not, giant boulders in a field, that means Beit Arba'at Kabin. You can have up to 4 kav of rocks in a big field of a core, right? A kav is a 26th, right? 24th, sorry, of Isa'ah. So 4 kav is 4 out of 196. So 196 kav in a beit core. So if you have 4 kav, it means around 2%, I think, right? So it's around 2%.
1/24th. It's 1/24th of a kav.
So
1/24th of a sa'ah.
A kav is 1/24th of a sa'ah, correct? And there are 15 sa'ah, right, in the field. Sorry, 30 sa'ah in the field. But 4 kav are 1/6.
15 times the Beit HaMikdash.
Correct.
That's 30?
So that is correct. So anyways, you can have up to 4 kav in the field that we talked about in our Mishnah of a Beit Sa'ah, of a core, sorry. I'm sorry, I keep getting these numbers wrong. It's really tricky. So the Mishnah talked about a core. You're allowed to have a 4 kabim within that core of the field that is full of rocks. And so you basically have to do the math. Says the Gemara, though, just to be very clear, they can't just be all in one section, right? Because if all 4 kav of rock, if you have one rocky section, that's a problem also, because you can't harvest the field. You can't plow the field. So it says Rav Ukva Bar Chama, they have to be mufla'in b'chameshet kabim. There has to be 4 in at least a minimum of 5 kabim. There could be 6, 7, 8, or 9, as the Rashbam points out. But meaning you can't have 4 kav together. It can't be 4 out of 4, right? It has to be at least 4 out of 5, and of course, ideally, it'd be 4 out of 10 or more. And says Ruchia Bar Abba, similar concept, but adding a detail. Husha mufla'in b'ruba shel sadeh. They have to be scattered throughout the majority of the field, meaning they can't be just in one section of the field, right? Because then, again, you basically lose a whole area of your field. So they have to be spread throughout the field. Now, ask Ruchia Bar Abba, let's say, Ruban b'mi'uta u'mi'utam b'ruba. Right? Let's say you have up to 4, a little bit less than 4 kav, and they are spread out in the field, but most of them, Ruban, are in a small amount of the field, and a small amount of them are in the rest of the field. Mahu, meaning how separated do these stones have to be? Right? Remember, if it's one big stone that's 10 feet tall, that doesn't count at all. You got to take that out of the field. But you've got a whole bunch of small stones that are a foot tall, right? Let's say you're allowed to have up to 4 kav in the big field, but you can't have them all together, and you can't have them all in one small section of the field. But what if most of them are in one small section and some are in a large section, Mahu? And he says, Teiko, we can't, we don't really have the granular answers as to exactly how rocks are allowed to be allowed. And by Rabbi Yirmiyah, asked Rabbi Yirmiyah a very similar question. Turn the page now to Kuf Gimel Amud Bet. What if Kishir, Mahu? What if they're spread? A shear usually means like a bracelet, right? And I don't know what this picture in the Rashbam, if you have on the top left in your Gemara, is a very elaborate bracelet. But the point is, what if they're not spread out? So the Rashbam points out, right? If these things are sort of at the edge of the field, or a square even, you can plow in between them, right? Because remember, you always plowed in 2 directions. You go up and cross, called sheti ve'erev, right? Perpendicular and whatever the opposite of that is, right? So you would do 2 directions. If they're in a circle, then basically as you pull your plow, you have to keep lifting it because of the rocks. So you can't do, you can't lift it in one spot, get over the bump of rocks, and then keep going, because as a circle, it keeps coming around. So that seems to be more problematic. So would that be okay if it was spread out like a bracelet? Or kishurama, what if they were like a shura means a row, but again, you have this beautiful picture in the Rashbam, which is essentially a row, meaning not one straight row, but many, many different spots within it, right? So you can't really, plant any consistent row because there's tiny rocks everywhere. Or what if it's stadion mahu? What if it's now, stadion usually means a stadium, right? But we understand here, the Rashbam again has a beautiful picture that in the stadium, right, they would have the rams, the what do you call it, the bulls, right? So really, stadion is a code name for bulls, and what we're showing you here are the horns of a bull, right, which go out at an angle. And again, this just makes it very challenging to plow in any kind of organized way. And the final case we ask is akalaton mal. What if it's zigzag, like the other picture in the Rashbam? In all these cases, teku. So again, we don't really have a very clear understanding of, we know that very large rocks don't count. Small rocks are okay, but there is a limit to how many small rocks you can have. The limit is 4 kav in a big field, but we don't really know what if they're arranged in such a way that makes it super difficult to farm. Would that be a problem, or would you just say, you accept up to 4 kav in a field? Tana, now another detail the Braita says, again, these are very relevant if you're buying a field, but not so relevant if you're not. Tana on the second line, imhaya sela yichidi. Let's say you have a field that's just one field, one rock, it's solitary, but it's on the edge of the field, right? Says the Braita, afilu kolshu, even if it's a tiny rock, like a 1-foot rock, or even 5 inches, ein nimdad ima, you don't count that in the field, meaning you have to make the border. It's not in the center of the field, it's on the edge of the field, and because it's on the edge of the field, you exclude it from the field no matter how small it is. But what if it's not exactly in the border, but it's close to the border, right? So then the same thing. Afilu, the Rashbam mentions this means on the inside as opposed to the other one, which was the outside. Afilu kolshu in imdadima. Even if it's small, you also don't count it. And boy, Rav Papa, but asked Rav Papa just the detail of this. What if mufsak afar bintayim? What if there's a tiny little strip of dirt between the border, and then there's like 3 inches of dirt, let's just say, and then a rock, right? So it's very close, but there's a tiny bit of dirt. What about in that case? Is that considered to be on the border and you'd exclude it? Or is it considered to be in the middle of the field and you include it? Teiko, and we don't really have a great answer for that. And one final question, which we also will not resolve, was by Rav Ashi, asked Rav Ashi, what if it's not solid rock, right? And this obviously was a very common occurrence. What if you had afar milamata, you had dirt below, vitsunma milamal, and you had a rock, and this is referring to rock that's much less solid, right? Like flint kind of rock, that's above. That's what usually we use sunma to mean. But you have rock that's above, meaning you have a very shallow rock. So in theory, you can plow through it, or you can crush it up. So it's not like, huge, deep mountainous rock. It's a small amount of rock on top of dirt. Or the opposite. You have afar milamala, you have dirt on top, but very deep, very shallow, 2 or 3 tfachim in, you have tsunma milamata, you have a rock underneath it. So those cases are not solid rock, right? But they're basically a little bit of rock. So what do you view that case? Mahu, and again, the answer is Teiko. We don't really resolve any of these questions about the fine nuances of what rocks are permitted or prohibited within a field. So
we said if we have a huge rock, it's not counted. So to what extent? I mean, if the huge rock takes up 80% of the field, then there's no field to sell, right? I mean, how large is a huge rock? When we say it's not counted.
what do you mean? No,
If we said it's a large rock, or
if you sell someone a beit core, right? Let's say a beit core is 7 acres.
right,
And if portion of that 7 acres is a rock, it means you have to give them more land.
right. So it's not counted as part of the sale. I mean, he doesn't fulfill the sale then. I mean,
Correct. He has to give them extra land.
Okay, so when you're just saying not counted, I wasn't sure how we could say it's not counted. No, it's not part of the land. He has to sell them. He has to make up that land then.
Correct. If it's
Okay.
if it's a large rock, the question is what's a large rock? So 10 tfachim is a large rock.
Right.
Anything at the border we said is considered to be not counted. Things in the middle do count, meaning they're considered to be land, even though they're rock, as long as they're not too tall and they're not all bunched together. But all the questions we just had, the 10 questions or so we just had, was what if it's small rocks, but they're in a circle, so it makes it hard to plow, or they're in a square, or like we had in the case in the Rashbam, or they're in an angle, or they're rocky, but underneath the rock is dirt. Is that considered to be a rock, or is that considered to be dirt? So all of these cases we didn't really resolve. So the mission is very clear. If it's more than 10 tfachim, then it doesn't count as part of the field, and you have to replace it with other land. If it's on the edge, doesn't count, etc. But what about all these smaller things? We don't know, and we don't resolve all of them.
So, but practically, what does he do? He says, "Well, we don't know what to do." Then does the buyer get extra land? Does the buyer get extra land to compensate for that? If we don't,
in which case? In which case?
Well, any one of these teku cases.
No. So all right. So usually what we do in the case of teku is it's hamotzi mechaver olav haraya, right? You'd have to prove it. So basically, if I bought land from you that was say 7 acres, and I thought 1 acre, if it was the stuff that is teku, I could pay you, I guess, 6 acres worth and say, prove that I owe you the rest, right? And conversely, if I already paid you and I want to get my money back, I'd have to prove it, which I can't. So that's generally how we view teku, which is, it's a safek, and you'd have to prove, and you can't prove one way or the other. So whoever sort of paid is out of luck.
Well, then he may not agree to buy it. Then I mean, he says this.
Right. Of course not. I mean, yeah. If you should inspect the field. That's a whole different smart thing to do. Continues the Mishnah. Another detail. We're going to get more into this. We're not done with the parak. Don't worry. Says the Mishnah now on Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Bet 103b. What if you say, and again, this is a similar case, Beit Kor Afar Ani Mocher Lecha Mada Becheva. That's what you say in that whole sentence. I want to buy from you a Beit Kor of dirt measured with a rope, right? That's like a surveyor, right? You would take a rope and you would go around the field, meaning I basically say to you, I want an exact field, okay? So I say those words, Mada Becheva. Then, and the guy comes to you and he says, okay, I have a field, on 47th Street and 3rd Avenue. That's a Beit Kor. Here's $1 million. Here's the field. Of course, you show up to the field and it's not a Beit Kor, right? Says the Mishnah, if it's Pichat Kolsho, if it's anything less, anything, right? Because I bought an exact amount of space. If it's a little bit less than that, let's say it's 1% less, then Yigbeh. Then you have to collect, basically, meaning that the guy has to pay you back whatever percentage of money that is missing from the field, right?
It
So you
says, I
collect.
think, I don't think it says yigbeh, it says yinakeh. It's a cuff.
Oh, thank you.
Cuff. It's a cuff, not a bit.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm using Internet Gemara, which is very, very fuzzy. So it's a picture of a Gemara. Thank you. So I appreciate that. That's correct. Yin nakeh, which means you take away from the amount of money that you have to pay, right? So same idea, but yes, correct. So the word in the Mishnah is yin nakeh. So you basically paid $1 million for, say, a Beit Kor. If it's 1% missing, you get back $10,000, right? Hotir lo kolshu. Now, let's say it's a little bit extra. Let's say you go and you sit down in the field and it's actually, 1% more than a Beit Kor, then yachzir. And you got to give back the extra land because you bought exactly a Beit Kor, right? And you said, I measured it with the rope, which means it's a precise, exact Beit Kor. Now, however, Imamar, if you were clever and you said, or maybe not clever, but you said, hein chaser, hein yater, which means I'm buying a Beit Kor more or less, right? Whether it's a little bit less, whether it's a little bit more. Hein chaser, whether it's less, hein yater, whether it's more, then of course, it doesn't have to be exactly a Beit Sa'ah, right? A Beit Kor, sorry. So says the Mishnah, now how much can it be off, right? Because it does have to be approximate. How much can it be off? Im amar hin chaser hin yater, then afilu pichet rova l'sa'ah. Even if you're off 1/4 of a kav for a sa'ah. Those are the measurements I was trying to do before. So 1/4 as a kav for a sa'ah, then, which again, let's do the math, right? So a kav, there are 6 kav in a sa'ah, right? And so 1/4 of a kav is 1/4 of 1/6, which is 1/24th, right? So even if you're off by 1/24th, which is say 4%, oh, hotir rova l'sa'ah, or you go over and you give 4% extra, so 4% less or 4% extra, higio, then that is the deal. There's no going back, there's no extra, there's no reimbursement. You said, I'm selling you a Beit Kor, more or less. And so more or less means, and what we're saying, it means a rova, 1/4 of a kav for each sa'ah, meaning 4%, sorry, 1/24th, okay? Now, if it's yoter mikan, if it's more than that, let's say you're way off, you're 10% off, then yaseh cheshbon. Then you have to start doing an accounting and you have to figure out what's the extra, right? If you got extra, or what's missing if you got too little. Now, says the Mishnah, what does that mean? You do a cheshbon. Mahu machzir lo. Let's say, right, he got too much land. Right, so basically, he said to him, "I'm selling you a Beit Kor. The plot, and again, the Rashbam, of course, points out, as everyone understands, this has to be a case where you said a specific plot of land, right? Because if you didn't, and you said, "I'm selling you a Beit Kor," then he only acquired a Beit Kor. You can't go and say, "Oh, you sat down on a piece of land. It's 1.5 acres. That's what you get." Right, so it must be a case, like I said earlier, where you said, "I'm selling you this plot of land on the corner of 47th Street and 3rd Avenue." That's what I'm looking at right now, and I think it's a Beit Kor, right? If I say it's exactly a Beit Kor, that's the first case in the Mishnah, then it has to be exactly a Beit Kor. If I say it's around a Beit Kor, which is the second case, more or less, or as the Mishnah puts it, less or more, then you get basically around a 4% grace, right? 1/24th. But if it's more than that, then you've got to give it back. If it turns out you go sit on the land and it's 10% more than a Beit Kor, you have to be machzir. Ask the Mishnah now, Mahu machzir.
Doesn't he come with a rope? And he measured this?
No. The rope means that it was measured with the rope. It was surveyed and it was established, and we know for sure.
Exactly. So we know exactly how much he more. We know that.
Correct, but neither
exactly.
they did the sale and they were not in the land, right? They showed up at the land. They start measuring it and see what it is. So mahu machzirlo. So what do you return to the owner, the seller, right? Let's say the buyer got land that was a core and 10% more. He's got to return it, we said. What does he return? Says the Mishnah, you don't return the land, right? And the reason you don't return the land, we'll see in the Gemara tomorrow, because the land, you can't force him to return the land, because it might be very unusable for the seller, because he's got, a big core of land plus, 10%. He sold the core, he doesn't want the 10%, right? It's not much to do with that. So machzir lo ma'ot, so you give back money, meaning you have to pay whatever you paid for the core, you pay 10% more for the extra land. Imratza, now if the seller agrees, then machzir lo karka. You can give him back the land. Lama amru machzir lo ma'ot. Why do we say that ideally you have to pay and give money for the extra land? That is the yafot kocho shel mocher. That is to improve the power, to give strength to the seller. Again, we'll see in the Gemara why the seller is the one who deserves to get their strength increased. But it's to benefit the seller. Shem shier bisadeh, because now we'll see in the Gemara what this means, but what it essentially means is that there's a minimum amount of land that's useful for a field. Meaning, if I give you, a small strip of land, it's not that useful unless it's considered to be the minimum size for planting a field. What was the minimum size for planting a field? We said earlier, we've had this before, Shem shier bisadeh beit tisha kabim, right? For a field, you want 9 kav worth of planting, because less than 9 kav is really not worth, or at least it's less worthwhile to get the equipment and the people and everything in order to plant that field. So you really need 9 kabim. But a gina, remember a garden, which as we talked about earlier as well, was, obviously you don't farm it in the same way. You don't have animals. You don't have a big industrial operation. It's a garden. It's your vegetable garden. So there it's much, much smaller, and it's beit chatzi kav, so 1/18, right? Instead of 9 kav for a field, you need half of a kav for a garden. Again, these are always measurements of how much seed you can plant. So begina, it's half a kav. Ukedivrei Rabbi Akiva, now Rabbi Akiva was of the opinion that actually you can have a much smaller garden. It was half of that, beit rova, a quarter of a kav, right? So in all of those cases, if you have a amount that's extra that is suitable for a proper field, then machzir lo karka. Then you return the land, right? Because basically, let's say I bought a core and I got a core plus 9 kabim. Then the buyer can say, I don't want 9 kabim extra, I want a core. So he gives back the land. But if it's less than 9 kabim, let's say it's 5 kabim extra, then the seller can say, what am I going to do with 5 kabim? I can't plant that. So pay me the money prorated for 5 kabim of the field, and you keep the extra, and it's attached to your field. Says the Gemara, the final halacha, which we've had many times before, but it's very complicated. So we'll remind everyone, we're at the first wide line.
Yeah, lo et agrova bilvad.
Lo et arova bilvad hu machzir. And just to be clear, when you start, remember, we said, if you said, I'm selling you a field, that's more or less a core, right? Then it could be up to a rova ahead, a rova more, and it's still sold. Let's say it's 2 rovas, right? So then you have to return the extra. But says the Mishnah, you don't just return 1 rova. Meaning you don't say 4% was allowed. So I sold you a field that was 110%. I should return 6% to go down to the allowed number of 104. Once you're returning it, you go back to 100%, right? So lo et rova bilvad, you don't just return the extra space above a rova hu machzir, ela et kol hamotar. You have to return everything extra. So even though I said to you, I'm selling you a beit core, more or less a beit core, which we understand to mean up plus or minus 4%, is how we understood it. If you sell a field that turns out to be 110% of a beit core, you've got to return all 10% back to a beit core. It's not that you get to keep up to that amount. And we discussed this, of course, earlier many times in the Masechta when we're talking about returning things. Now, I'm going to stop here, but I want to read one more line and then we'll continue it tomorrow. Because a very interesting detail in our Mishnah is that our Mishnah talked about 2 cases. The first case is where you said, I'm selling you a beit core that is measured by a rope, meaning an exact beit core. You say those words. And the second case of the Mishnah was where you say, I'm selling you a beit core more or less, right? Yater o pachot, right? The other way, pachot o yater. Oh, right, more or less. The question the Gemara is going to ask tomorrow is the obvious middle case, right? What if you don't say either one? You just say, I'm selling you a beit core, and you don't say exactly a beit core, and you don't say more or less. You just say a beit core. So is that similar to the first case, similar to the second case? And I'm going to leave you on that cliff so that Rav Dov, I think, can pick this up tomorrow at the beginning of the Gemara. We'll stop there. Again, Shana Tova, everyone. I just want to say, we can talk about this later in the week, but it's going to be very challenging for me to do Daf Yomi next Motzei Shabbat. Because of, break fast, I'll be away, I'm going away. So I think the best idea might be just to try to learn a little extra on Sunday morning, if that's conceivable. But we can talk about other ideas.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you for joining us. Shana Tova, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Emotion. Bom,